Hi, hello, welcome back. So, I am going to be talking to you today about something that I love watching other booktubers do, which is my top five favourite fantasy series of all time. Now, I've not numerically ordered these because on some days I might think that one series is number one, on some days I might think that another is number one. So, it's really hard for me to quantify and say, yes, 100%, this is it, this is number one. So, what I'm going to do is just run through them in the order that I read them. For the first three, and those three are finished series, and then the second three are the second two, the fourth and fifth are unfinished series, which I am in one case up to date and in another almost up to date. So let's talk, and I'm going to start with something that some people might not even say is fantasy, which is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. So, The Dark Tower is a series of 7 novels published starting in 1982 and finishing in 2004. Now, the original novel in The Dark Tower was called The Gunslinger. It's still called The Gunslinger, but it was written as a series of short stories and then combined into a novel. And it was then rewritten and kind of reworked in 2003, right in time for the final novel, The Dark Tower. I have only read the new version, as I read these books all back to back in 2007, so after they'd all been long out. I had seen the comic series by Marvel come out and the artwork there by Jay Lee, and I'm a huge Jay Lee fan. And I was looking at this comic and thinking, like, oh, I'd like to read this. But then I found out that it was an adaptation of book 4 of The Dark Tower. So I was like, right, okay, I guess I'll start reading The Dark Tower. And I read book 1, and it's my first ever, this is funny, this is actually the first ever novel I've read by Stephen King. And I read The Gunslinger, and I loved it. It was fast paced. The world was just a complete mystery, but a very intriguing one. So it didn't feel like I didn't know anything, and it wasn't, and I was kind of confused. I was intrigued. So I went on to read the rest of the novels. I followed the character Roland. Roland Deschain is the name of the protagonist, on his path to try and climb the Dark Tower. It's a really, really interesting series with a lot of twists and turns that you'd never expect. It has some crossovers with kind of modern day America, and that's where some of the characters come from. And it has some really good intersections with, that modern day America, Stephen King's other novels. I don't know anything about how these intersections work because I've not read any of the novels that it crosses over with. Really, I've read a few more King novels since then, but I've not read any of the big ones. I've read Carrie, so that is kind of one of the big ones. I read Carrie, and I've read Fairy Tale that was released last year, both of which I loved. And I do plan to read more King. I have a copy of The Institute on my shelf, and I'm going to read it. And then at some point in the distant future, I'm kind of thinking that it might be time to do a full read of Stephen King and read all of his novels. I've never read one that I haven't enjoyed, and most writers that I follow, so for example, Brandon Sanderson says that Stephen King is the greatest living genre fiction writer, and I'd be hard pressed to argue with that. So I'll give you a little bit of background about the series before I move on. Now, King originally said that he was inspired by The Lord of the Rings to create an American fantasy epic. And he took on kind of Arthurian legend and cowboy movies, especially The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as massive inspirations. And he took that and kind of mushed it together into this kind of big, weird fantasy epic. This wasn't the first ever epic fantasy that I read, but it was the first weird one that I read, if that makes sense. So I'd never read anything like The Dark Tower, and that's one of the reasons why it stands with me and sticks with me still, is because I don't think I've ever read anything since that's like The Dark Tower. The closest I would say I've come is Neil Gaiman's American Gods, but there's nothing with this kind of depth and understanding of the world and the characters, and it's just, it's just this massive, incredible series that I absolutely love. There's been a couple of like adaptations in the past. So there's been a movie with Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey. McConaughey, like, perfectly cast, absolutely perfectly, and Idris Elba also very good as Roland. Like, I don't. It's hard to pick someone to play Roland who like isn't Clint Eastwood, but Idris Elba did a fantastic job. I don't know who I would cast in that role, honestly. Not Scott Eastwood. So I wouldn't really say watch the Dark Tower movie, but Mike Flanagan, who makes horror series on Netflix, has the right, and he is going to make a new series. So that's really exciting. Moving on. I don't want to spend forever on every single series, because otherwise this video will be 45 minutes long, and it's already 11:30, so I don't want to film too late tonight. Now, my second series, and I'm going to go a little bit to the left of most booktubers here. I'm going to talk about Brandon Sanderson, but I'm not going to talk about the Wheel of Time, and I'm not going to talk about the Cosmere. I'm going to talk about a specific series in the Cosmere, which is my favourite work that he's done. Many of you may be expecting me to say Stormlight Archive. You might be expecting me to say Mistborn Era 1. I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm going to say Mistborn Era 2. Now, Mistborn Era 2 is probably the least liked of Sanderson's Cosmere series. Many people, I've seen 1-star reviews of the latest book, The Lost Metal. And I think I get a lot of what I also got from Dark Tower from the Lost Metal, in that it's kind of that like merge between like the cowboy, early America's sort of Western frontier stuff, also with that kind of turn of the century, beginning of industrialization, and then mixing that with the magic system that Brandon Sanderson has created in allomancy and Furukami and hemalurgy. So all three magic systems work in this universe. And because time has moved on from the original series, you're starting to see not just the magic systems that we have become accustomed to in the original Mistborn, but you're also seeing what happens when those systems interact in the same person. So it's a really, really interesting story, and Wax in particular, the main character, has probably the coolest power set in the whole of the Mistborn series. And the villain in the original novel, the Alloy of Law, Miles 100 Lives, is just a really cool villain that I absolutely loved. All the villains are good, like across the entire series, but Miles 100 Lives and also Bleeder, who's the villain of Book 2, is probably my favourite Sanderson villain. So a little bit of kind of behind the scenes facts around this one. So Sanderson originally wrote Alloy of Law as a writing exercise to clear his palate, to clear his brain between finishing The Wheel of Time and starting a Stormlight Archive book, because both of those are massive megatomes that are over 1,000 pages with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of characters in The Wheel of Time's case. And he wanted that break. He wanted to make sure that he was firmly off Wheel of Time and firmly on to Stormlight Archive. So he wrote this kind of creative writing exercise, Alloy of Law. It's quite a short novel for Sanderson. It's, I think it's only just over 100,000 words, but he absolutely fell in love with it, and I did the exact same thing. And I was just following through the whole Cosmere from Mistborn, then to Warbreaker, and then to Stormlight Archive. I still haven't read Elantris. Don't at me about that. I will eventually read Elantris, but I've been putting it off forever, and it's kind of become a thing. So I was reading through, and I really liked Mistborn Era 1, and I finished Mistborn Era 1 and thought, wow, that was an awesome epic fantasy series, a really good ending. I don't know how he's gonna take it on from here. And then I read Alloy of Law, and it's obviously set a few hundred years later. And that shift in timeline, where we see not only that years have passed on, but also that the world has moved on without us. So in many fantasy books, and a lot of stuff really, you'll be like, oh, this battle was 400 years ago, but you're using the same weapons. You're still using swords, they're still riding horses. In Alloy of Law, we've gone from horses and swords to revolvers, rifles, and cars. And I just think that progression is really cool, and there's really, really few authors that have done that in their works, and I really appreciated that, especially. The main characters of the series are called Wax and Wayne, which is pretty funny in and of itself. Wax is the descendant of one of the major characters from the original trilogy. We also do, extremely light spoilers here, we do see characters from that original trilogy pop back up, as there are many characters in the Cosmere that have unnaturally long lives. So you do get to see people, turn back up hundreds of years later. I especially loved, my favourite book in this series is probably Shadows of Self, which was the second novel. Shadows of Self is the one, it's where Wax is dealing with Bleeder. As I said, Bleeder, my favourite villain in Sanderson, probably. And that's where you also get a lot of those returning Era 1 characters. It's a really, really excellent novel, and there's some kind of twists and turns that I often find that Sanderson's twists and turns are quite predictable, and I'll often see them coming a few chapters ahead. And maybe you saw it coming when you read the twist for Shadows of Self, but honestly, personally, I think I was maybe a page ahead of Wax, and only because I kind of had more information than needed. Now, interesting bit of trivia about Shadows of Self. Sanderson was actually having a lot of trouble with writing that one, so he wrote book 3 and then came back and wrote book 2 as kind of a bridge to get Wax from where he was to where he knew he needed to be. Now, there was a massive break between book 3 and book 4, which was the final book in Era 2, which came out last year. So 6 years between the two novels, which is a long time for Sanderson. Not long for a lot of other fantasy writers, but Sanderson was putting out a Mistborn book every year or two. But he took that time to write some other stuff. And then when he came back with The Lost Metal, he really wanted to tie a lot of stuff together. So I think that we'll look back on The Lost Metal as being kind of our Avengers moment. So a lot of people said, oh, it's the Avengers Infinity War of the Cosmere, but I really don't think it is, because we only see a few things come together, and we are still primarily dealing with our main characters from that main place. So it's not like you're bringing together, for example, the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy. It's more like you're bringing the Avengers together for the first time. I love that aspect as a big comic book fan, because it's very much like, those early crossovers that start setting up the big storylines. Some people don't like the ending. I still loved it. The only problem that I have with Era 2 of Mistborn is that it ends at a point where I feel like there's decades more story to be told, and there's an entire new novel series, I feel, in what one of the characters does at the end of the series. So, hard to say without really spoiling anything. I also would say that this is kind of one that you have to have read Mistborn Era 1 for, and there's even elements of the Mistborn Era 2 which kind of, they don't require you to read other stuff in the Cosmere. However, if you do read other stuff in the Cosmere, you do get that expanded experience. Now, I don't want to talk and gush too much about this series because I know that A, it's not massively well liked and I'm kind of out on my own here, but B, I've got a lot of it to talk about. So let's move swiftly on to the most recent series that I finished. This one's just a trilogy, so it's much shorter, much easier to read. This is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda. So the first novel in this series, Jade City, was published in 2017. Then it was followed 2 years later by Jade War, and 2 years after that by Jade Legacy. So the entire series was done in 6 years, 2 years gap between each one. It's a secondary world urban fantasy. So think of like The Godfather, but set in fantasy Asia. And it's kind of got a really interesting magic system. So where you would see someone like Sanderson who's like, oh, these people can take in this type of energy and then output this type of magic. What they have in Jade City and in the Greenbone Saga is that there are Greenbone warriors who can use a gemstone called Jade, which is native to Kikon, the island that the series takes place in, and they're able to, when they touch Jade to their skin, if they are the type of Kikonese person that is reactive to Jade, then they're able to use certain powers. And you can train yourself in those powers in the same way that you can train yourself in martial arts or running or any sort of physical exercise. So you can get stronger by practicing, but you can also just add more Jade and gain power that way. However, adding too much Jade too fast can cause reactions not unlike drug addiction. It's a really, really interesting magic system. It's very simple and easy to understand, and Fonda kind of sets it out for you pretty much straight away. I'm a massive, massive fan of this universe. It revolves kind of around the tensions and wars between these two warring crime families called clans. And we follow in particular one family, and we see kind of their journey through quite a long period of time. We're talking like 50 plus years, especially with the final novel Jade Legacy, which is set over, or it must be over like 20 years worth of history. And Fonda will do massive jumps where she's like 3 years later, 2 years later, and you're like, oh no, what's happened in that time? And one of the biggest problems that I have with the Greenbone Saga, and I say the biggest problem because it's a very, very minor problem. That problem is that I want more of it. And Fonda has said that she's done. Now, Jade Legacy and like the whole Greenbone Saga, the first 2 books, they almost feel like they're the first 2 books in, say, a 5-book series. And then Jade Legacy feels like 3 books cut down into 1. It's still excellent. I do think that Jade War is my favourite in the series, and I think that weirdly I'm also out on a limb on that one as well, because most people like Jade Legacy the best, and then I've got a few people like, for example, Mike from Mike's Book Reviews loves Jade City the best, and I love Jade City, but I think that the side story that you see with one of the characters living in Port Massey, which is another country, where Jade is outlawed and kind of underground, and he lives in a Kikonese immigrant community out there. That story is really, really excellent and was kind of a massive selling point for me on just how much I love that series. So Jade War, my favourite book. Absolutely incredible characters that I completely and utterly fell in love with, and a truly vivid, well-designed and a well-lived-in world. And Greenbone Saga is like one of the one of those novels where the most tense scenes, they might not be, two Jade Warriors in single combat on a side street. It's like boardroom stuff. It's murders in the dark. Um, I often think about the meme about Succession that went around on Twitter that was like, "Oh, this is the most powerful scene on TV this year," and it's just two people talking at an office desk, and that's kind of Greenbone Saga in some points. Like some of the most memorable, my favorite moments in this series are just conversations. Um, and the tension between the clans and the fact that the clans are kind of publicly accepted, so they have this like public face, and how they have to kind of keep up appearances. It's just excellent. I love, love, love this series. Next up, we'll come to what, if you ask me, on most days, I would say is probably my favourite fantasy series of all time. Sometimes I'll waver and I'll say, oh, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Let's talk about The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. You might not be expecting this, although I've kind of almost picked three urban fantasies, so maybe you were expecting The Dresden Files. The Dresden Files is a 17-book with some short stories ongoing urban fantasy series about Chicago's only wizard for hire, Harry Dresden. Set in the modern day, the first book was released in 2000, and it's called Stormfront, and the latest, book 17, was released in 2021, and we have another book expected in 2024. Jim Butcher has said that he's going to be writing 22 case files books. So each Dresden Files book is quite short. They're like the same sort of length as a Mistborn Era 2 novel, just over 100,000 words, and they're all kind of like a case. And Butcher often says that the Dresden Files are the worst day of Harry's year. So he's living his whole life outside of these books, and then we get like that one horrible weekend, and that's what Jim covers. So there's roughly a year's distance between every book, and I just love these books. Harry starts out as kind of like a private detective, and he's working with his clients, and he's helping the police to solve magical problems and crimes. And I won't spoil where he gets to and where he's at currently, but let's just say that it's very, very different. And he's been through so much. I mean, if he hadn't been through that much in 17 novels, you probably would be a bit curious as to what he's actually been doing. Now, the most recent book was split in two, leaving us with kind of one book that was just all tension and build up, and then a second half that is literally like Avengers Endgame level of action. Every single character is back. Every single enemy is back. Everyone is fighting everyone. It's the book is called Battleground because it is the entire novel is a battle. It's almost like at the end of Sanderson's Stormlight Archive books, he might have, the final 10-20% of that novel will just be fight. And that's kind of what Battleground is. Battleground is basically the fight that ends the previous novel. I absolutely loved Peace Talks and Battleground. I read them back to back because I came to the series late, because I've come to basically every series late, and because I only really started reading again hardcore in like the end of 2021. Now, interestingly, Butcher says that he basically wrote the Dresden Files to prove his writing teacher wrong, which I think is very funny and very on brand for Barry Dresden. He was told that everything that he was writing was kind of too complicated, wouldn't sell. And so his writing teacher was like, look at this Anita Blake Vampire Hunter novels. They sell really well. Write something like that. And so he said, if you wrote something like that, it would be trash. And he went away and he came back to prove to her that, it would be trash. And then turns out it was excellent, and she was like, you can sell this. And he's, 17 books later and multiple other series under his belt. Butcher's just created this incredible world with characters that I feel like I really intimately know, and there's never really have I been so emotionally on board with characters as I have been in the Dresden Files. I'll talk very, very briefly about the criticisms of the Dresden Files. So, I'm not the person to speak about this, but there are some people who consider Harry to be sexist, and there are some people who kind of don't like the entire series is first person, and they don't like living in Harry's head because of the things that he discusses in his inner monologue. I completely understand. However, I'm able to see past that to the character writing and the plot and that sort of thing. Now, the best book in this series, I haven't really said best book for all of them, but I'll say best book again here, is Skin Game, where Harry is teaming up with his arch rival to do a heist, like proper Ocean's 11 style. And he's not just doing any old heist, he's doing a heist on Satan in hell. So, just brilliant, so much fun. You really can't go wrong with this book. Changes is probably the most famous book in the series, because so much about Harry's life changes in that one book, and it has an incredible ending, absolutely incredible, 5-star book, absolutely completely a 5-star book. However, Changes is just so much, whereas Skin Game is more of a classic Dresden caper. Now, let's come on to the final book series. And I'm not a big physical book guy. I normally get my books from the library, but because this series is self-published, I own it. And this is The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. It's as I said, self-published fantasy series. First book came out in 2021. Most recent book came out this year. There are currently 3 novels in the series and 2 novellas, with a 3rd novella that is out next month, September of 2023. I have read books 1 and 2 and novellas 1 and 2, and I'm currently reading The Mammoth of War and Ruin, which is book 3 in the series. I've not made much progress this week because I've been making booktube videos and kind of setting up my channel, but I am loving this book. I'm already a couple of 100 pages in, and it has that instant page turner quality that I love about people like Dresden Files. I love about Mistborn Era 2, where I just can't stop reading, and I'm looking at the clock and going, oh, it's midnight, I've got to go to bed. But, real quick one. This book series is probably the easiest one for you to try, because all of the books are on Kindle Unlimited, and the first novella is completely free. No Kindle Unlimited, no nothing. All you have to do is go to Ryan's website and sign up for his newsletter, and he'll send you a copy of the book. Now, the series is about, it's kind of an epic fantasy in that traditional elves, dwarves, dragons kind of fantasy world. And it's about, stop me if you heard this one before, it's about a group of young men from a small village in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, and how, through circumstances, they all end up being drastically important to the fate of the world. The world of Etheria in which it's set is currently ruled by an emperor who worships a dark god, and it's the world is kept in check by the threat of the emperor's force of dragon riding knights called the Dragon Guard, and no dragon has been born for 400 years that has not been part of this Dragon Guard. And then suddenly a dragon is born around these characters from this small village, and it's how they link in together with these kind of very old heroes from old battles and wars that they've lost to this evil empire, and how they together are kind of working to save the world from not just the Empire, but also supernatural threats of kind of these orc-like creatures. It's just excellent. The world building is incredible. I remember reading the first novel and being like, this is really good. And it read to me almost like somebody who is on their fourth fantasy series. It didn't feel like someone's first ever novel, let alone their first fantasy novel of kind of this epic scale and scope. But Cahill's really smart in that he keeps the majority of book one to Cahill's viewpoint. And so we follow Cahill. We're in his head. We're seeing how he feels and how he interacts with the world, and he's introduced to a lot of elements of the world in the same way that we are. Then we go into the Fall. So I read the Fall second, which is, so you can read this first or you can read this second. I think reading it second is more fun because then you get introduced to those elements of the magic and the dragons and all that as Cahill is being introduced to it rather than being introduced to it and then losing it all and being introduced to it again, So the second book, Cahill adds in more POVs, and every single new POV you meet is really interesting and excellent. I'm just in shock over how good this series is. I would say, is absolutely on a par with like Sanderson's Stormlight Archive. I think that it is better than Mistborn Era 2 that I have put as the best of Sanderson's work. So you make your own conclusion from there. I don't want to gush too long about this one because I'm actually going to do full reviews for every book in the series. What I'll probably do is do book novella in one video, book novella in one video, book novella. So although maybe the Ice, because it's going to be a brand new release when I read it, I'll do that as a separate video. So please stay tuned to the channel. Please drop me a subscribe. If you have read any of these books, then let me know what you thought. Let me know whether you hate Mistborn Era 2. Let me know whether you don't understand why everyone loves the Dark Tower, because a lot of people have said that too. What I am going to say now is that there's probably a lot of series that are missing from here that you're like, why is he not talking about Wheel of Time? Why is he not talking about Lord of the Rings? Why is he not talking about Song of Ice and Fire or Realm of the Elderlings? In many cases, I have not read those series. So I have actually read A Song of Ice and Fire. I would not rate it as highly as these purely because I don't like the last two books. Whereas Kingkiller Chronicle, the second book's rubbish. It is rubbish. You might have a different opinion to me. You might think the second book is excellent. I think the second book is fan fiction level bad. And I will probably not even read the third novel if it comes out. Wheel of Time, never read it. First novel is on the shelf. I watched the TV series and liked it. I'm the one person who liked the Wheel of Time TV show. And then other fantasy series. Realm of the Elderlings, I've read the Farseer trilogy. I've read Ship of Magic. I'm reading Mad Ship by the end of this year. Let me know if there's any fantasy series that I have missed and that I need to read. I've got a lot already on my TBR that I'm planning to read. I would really love to start Malazan and Wheel of Time, although not at the same time. I recently bought the Malazan Humble Book Bundle, where I got all of the Malazan books for like £14. It was amazing. It's still currently running if you're watching this video the day it publishes. I'm going to wrap this video up because it's already incredibly long. Thank you so much for watching. As I said, leave comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel for the Ryan Cahill reviews that are coming up, and I will speak to you soon.